Welcome everybody to Housing Washington's very first session. I have the pleasure today to introduce Amy Clark. Amy and I go way back. She was actually on the planning committee for Housing Washington several years back in her role as the communications lead for the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance. She has moved on to other areas and can tell you a little bit more about that background, but she is a communications professional with an extensive knowledge of housing and has worked throughout her career to help to elevate the housing messaging across all communications channels. So I thought she was a perfect person to join us at Housing Washington today. And I want to thank Amy, and I'm going to encourage all of you to provide any sort of comments you have in chat, questions or anything like that, and I'll be monitoring chat, and at the end of Amy's remarks, I will go through and send her some of your questions. Thank you and welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you this morning and to be part of this conference that, as Cheryl said, I have so much history with. Just a little about me for the many of you who I'm sure I have not met yet. My expertise is really in message development, media, strategy. Most recently, I was the communications director of SEIU Healthcare 1199 Northwest. It's the largest healthcare workers union in Washington state. Prior to that, I spent some time in DC at the National Housing Conference and National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and of course, was at the Housing Alliance. Little photo of me back in the before times when we did these kinds of things in person. So right now I'm kind of out on my own, as it turns out, doing communications for a hospital union during a viral pandemic is pretty burnout inducing. So I'm taking a step back and making some plans for what's next right now. But great to be here with you this morning. So I thought a little bit about what we could do together this morning, and I thought it might be helpful or useful if we kind of looked at a case study together of some sort of opposition messaging or anti-housing messaging, and kind of dig through it, understand together kind of what's going on in that communication piece, and then talk together about what we do as housing advocates, as a housing community, to counter that kind of messaging and put forward our message, a stronger and better message about why affordable housing is so important. So warning, it's a little aggravating, but we'll get through it. So I'm going to try to put this in the chat here as well. But the op-ed that I found that I'd like us to take a moment to read together is a guest column in the Yakima Herald Republic, written by Tim Lovelace, who's a home builder. You see his photo here, and a member of the Central Washington Home Builders Association. I'm sure we may have some folks from Central Washington who have joined us here today, and I hope this isn't too kind of triggering for you to see, and you all could tell the story a lot better than I can, but there was a measure before the Yakima City Council last month to enact a sales tax that would fund affordable housing development, and this op-ed was written in opposition to that. The measure ultimately didn't pass, but this is sort of a good opportunity, I think, for us to take a look at some anti-housing messaging. So you can type this short link into your phone, or open the link I put in the chat in another tab on your computer. And let's just take a couple of minutes, a minute or two, to skim through this article together, and then we'll come back and kind of talk about it. All right. As you are finishing reading through this op-ed, I encourage you to sort of share in the chats your thoughts, kind of the things that come up for you as you're reading this. What do you see in what he wrote? What stood out to you? The first thing that really stood out to me was how Tim frames the issue. So right out of the gate, he's talking about lattes, he's talking about tax hikes, he's talking about sound transit. And this is something that's published in a newspaper that serves Yakima County, right? This is central Washington, very far away from sound transit and like the regional taxing authority that funds sound transit, right? But he's bringing up all of these sort of unrelated things, right? Which is really, it's the Seattle liberal agenda, right? It's that sort of trope about what Seattle's like, about the latte sipping liberal. So right out of the gate, the framing is trying to tie these sort of Seattle liberal ideas to this tax that's being proposed in Yakima, miles and miles away. The other thing that stood out for me in reading this is he's saying, he's talking about bureaucracy and waste, those six-figure government salaries, which I'm sure there are some government workers who are here with us today. I'm sure you're just rolling in your millions. And of course, he points out that, the tax didn't work, right? The soda consumption didn't change, which isn't true, but that's neither here nor there. It's a story of waste, fraud, and abuse, right? This is a really common trope that we hear, a common frame that folks put forward about what government does, right? It's just wasteful. It doesn't work. There's all kinds of folks making millions and getting away with some things. So that's the frame that we see right out of the gate. The other thing that kind of stood out to me was the audience that I think our author here is writing to. This tax that he's opposing would fund affordable housing, rental apartments, right? And we have kind of a sense of who the folks are who would benefit from or who would need that kind of housing. But that's not the folks I think that he is writing to. So in an article about a tax that would fund rental housing, he's talking about home prices, he's talking about mortgages, he's talking about Fannie and Freddie, right? All of this home ownership stuff. So what's that all about, right? So I think this is a divide and conquer strategy. He's speaking directly to homeowners, and really, I think who he's talking to is that prospective home buyer, the prospective first-time home buyer, someone who, rightly, if they're moderate income, if they're trying to get into a home for the first time, they're rightly concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to do that, right? Home prices are pretty high right now, and over over the decades, folks in the middle class have been rightly concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to keep a foothold in that, right? So he's speaking directly to that group and telling them that he has their interests in mind, right? Dividing them away from the other group of people who is also very concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to get a foothold in our economy and in their community, people who are struggling to afford rental housing, right? He's siloing off, dividing away the homeowners and saying, listen to me, I'm here for you. And then I think we see his agenda, and it's a little buried, but to me, it comes through in this talk about the lumber and supply chain issues, the amount of money that this tax would cost home building companies, right? So his own interest comes through, maybe not loud and clear, right? Because this is buried pretty deep in the article, but he's framing his interest as being in the interest of the that audience, that middle income homeowner, the prospective first time home buyer. But really, right, this is about the bottom line for Tim Loveless, for home builders like him, right? If there's the sales tax, that's going to have an impact on their profit margin. And so that's the real concern here, dressed up in a lot of talk about the impact on the community, the impact on, the tax potentially not being effective, because taxes are never effective, because that's what government is, right? So he's kind of wrapping all of that around the true concern from his perspective. And, I think there's a debate that we could have about whether a sales tax, which arguably is regressive, whether that's the best mechanism for funding affordable housing development. And I'm sure there is a ton of consideration and a lot of factors that went into the choice to put that measure forward. And Tim, in the intro of the article, of the op-ed, even sort of gets to or hand waves at that, right? Saying that, sales taxes that take millions of dollars out of the pockets of the poor, right? He's hand waving at the idea of a sales tax being regressive. But again, that's not what this op-ed is. It's not a debate on the substance. It's really putting forward something that divides and is about the bottom line for him and his interests. So I think there's some things that that we can understand from this and that will help us combat this kind of messaging. I think there's some parallel strategies that we can take on. But let's go through a little bit of what our strategy as housing advocates is. So what we want to be able to do is to engage and activate existing and potential supporters of affordable housing development. So we are about getting things done, right? So we want to engage our supporters with the values that they share. And definitely there is a group of people in any community, right, who looks at any tax and says, that's just, true blue liberals, latte sipping Uncle Sam sticking his hands into my pocket. And I'm not going to support that. But there's a lot of people who are going to see it differently. And we engage those folks using shared values. We want to unmask the opposition. We want to make really clear to the people who we're talking to who opposes affordable housing development and what they're doing to sort of put that opposition forward and what they stand to gain from it. It's not a coincidence or an accident that they're opposed. And we want to unite these supporters. Once we've engaged them, we want to unite them around a positive vision for the future. This isn't about saying no to things. It's not about voting things down. It's not even necessarily about a specific policy or specific development. It's about what we want to build for our future, what our communities are going to look like when we do our work successfully. And then we want to invite them to take action and be part of this. Right? So our framing. Number one, we want to bring in shared values that mesh with what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Right? We're creating opportunity. We are bringing more equity into our communities. We're building community, right? Another thing that I think is really important to do, particularly around issues that involve the work of government, that involve using taxes to fund the things that we want to see in the world. It's important to show how what we're proposing, what we're doing is something that is core and essential to our community. We saw in that op-ed that Tim was trying to paint this affordable housing sales tax as an idea that came from essentially a foreign place, right? And we want to be able to tell the story that solving these problems, addressing these challenges, using these tools, this is something that our community has done before. It's something we can do again. It's something that, you know, we've gotten behind. We have examples of that success. And it's not about some bogeyman. It's about our community addressing our own challenges. Then defining the opposition. So this is some kind of strong language, but there's a specific villain, right? There's a specific opponent or group of opponents who are part of any of these fights. And it's not always a fight, but when it is, we want to call out who is opposed and why they're opposed. It's not just some people, it's this specific group. And point out what they stand to gain. It's really important for us to help our supporters understand what the dynamics are at play, so that that they can kind of parse the messages. It's I think, you know, we have sort of an easy time looking at an op-ed like the one we reviewed and understanding what's at play, because we're in this work, we're doing this, we're dealing with these conversations day in and day out. But for the person who is just kind of dropping in, noticing something that's happening in the community, reading an article, hearing something on the radio, they're not necessarily as engaged or have the same deep understanding that we do. So really help people understand who this opposition is. And I think we see again coming from the opposition that division is part of their one of the most effective parts of their toolkit, right? And I think the supporters who we have are likely to understand the world in a different way. They're likely to, if you're likely to support affordable housing, you're more likely to be someone who is going to understand that we have shared fates, right? My existence, my success, my access to opportunity is tied up in some way with your access to opportunity, with your opportunity for success. And sometimes, you know, the division is sort of specific in the way that we saw in the op-ed, with the author trying to divide the interests of homeowners and the interests of renters. Oftentimes it's dividing people on the basis of race. And whatever it is, it can be incredibly effective to call that out and make clear that people are profiting from that division, right? Whether it's literally financially profiting or otherwise, there's a benefit to them to creating that division that might not be there otherwise if they weren't digging in that wedge. And then we talk about what we're for. So it's really, really important to focus on our vision for the future and really paint that picture. I've talked in similar spaces before about sort of landscape versus portrait. So portrait stories are great. You know, a story or a message or what have you about an individual person, an individual family, how they've succeeded because of our work. That's great. But what's even more effective at helping our audience see those shared fates and see why there's a real impact for not just that individual family or person, but for themselves and for the whole community, is by painting that landscape picture. So what does it do for our economy, for our schools, for our healthcare system when people have affordable homes? Bring in those other voices, those other parts of the world and of our communities to show how everyone's going to benefit from your new housing development or from the new piece of legislation that's being proposed. And then, as tempting as it is, particularly if you're countering the kind of messaging that we saw in that op-ed, it's so tempting to sort of counter something directly, right? And say, you know, they believe in this, but we want to do this. We're against this thing that they're suggesting. The more we mention and uplift our opposition's message, the more traction it's going to get, the more airtime it's going to get. And so what we want to do is really focus on our message, what we're for. And, you know, when we talk about the opposition, we talk about who they are, we talk about their motives. And when we talk about us, we talk about what we're about. And then, as I said, we're not just about no, right? We're trying to bring people together to support a new development, to come out and speak in favor of, you know, a new supportive housing development. We want people to come out and vote for candidates who support affordable housing. We want them to be contacting their lawmakers. We want people to take action, right? We're not trying to deactivate people. We're trying to bring them hope and inspire them to be part of something, to be part of what we're creating together. And in your sort of call to action messaging, this is an opportunity to talk about the shared fates, to talk about how this is going to help all of us, and really call out, you know, no matter who we are or where we come from, this is something that's a benefit to all of us. And again, lift up the outcomes that we're aiming for, not just the specific policies. It's important to be clear. You know, you don't want to hide the fact that you're developing supportive housing, or you don't want to hide the details of a bill, right? But what is going to engage people to take action is the outcome that we're seeking, right? It's not about a 2% tax on 6% of expenditures on whatever. It's about making sure that everyone has the opportunity to live in a secure, affordable home, right? So speak to the outcomes and help your audience understand that, you know, the movement that we're asking them to be part of is about achieving that vision. And then be definitive. This isn't about we're going to try or we're going to do our best. You want to use language that that's definitive, that shows that you're just as committed to this as you're asking supporters to be. So we will make this change. We must unite around this issue. So I'm going to stop there because I know we want to have time for questions. A couple of resources for you that could be helpful, that I always appreciate using. We Make the Future. If you've seen the race class narrative used anywhere, they've sort of, the folks who are behind the creation of the race class narrative have started a whole organization called We Make the Future. They do campaigns that are both suitable for nonprofits and suitable for in the more 501c4 space. And so kind of choose your own adventure there in terms of if you're going to copy any of the language that they create. But that's a great resource, particularly for thinking through how race and class fit into all of this. And then the Opportunity Agenda Communications Toolkit is a great resource for building in kind of values messaging into your work. So this is an easy to remember email address for me. I am, as I said, I've stepped away and I'm kind of figuring out what I want to do next, but that means I'm mostly reading library books and taking walks. So please feel free to contact me. I will be happy to chat with you about any of this at a later time and to take any questions now.
I'm going to jump in with some questions. First off, thank you. I think that there's a lot in here that I hope everybody will pay attention to. I'm also a communications professional, so I can appreciate what Amy's been saying. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about is that I think that I would just maybe stress a little more of what you've talked about. Communication messages that stress benefit and are brief and to the point really, really seem to work. One of the things we find is the simpler the message and the more refined the message is to a particular audience, it really makes a difference. I know some of you were maybe around a few years back where we had a speaker who spoke about the fact that the library in her area was going to was struggling with new taxes to fund it. It's all about money, right? So when you talk about money, it becomes a whole different issue than when you talk about benefits. So when she shifted the conversation to, well, let's burn the books and close the library, everybody went crazy saying, no, we're not going to do that. And the taxes passed because that's what was necessary to keep the library open. We're in that similar situation right now with what's happening in DC and that whole infrastructure bill. Everybody's talking money, but not talking about what we're going to get for the money. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think we have we sort of as a society have been trained somewhat by years of really effective messaging from folks who are anti-tax, essentially, to be scared of taxes and to look at those big numbers and get very worried about what it means, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of, there are slogans that we can all repeat from memory from having heard them so often, right? We don't have, we don't have a budget problem, we have a spending problem, right? Like there's a very strong idea in our culture that, spending is bad, right?
The whole read my lips, no new taxes kind of thing. The simple message that just kind of hits on one issue, taxes.
Yeah, exactly. Really, it's been, and I think simple/simplistic, right, is really the key there. And the other thing that we run into is just, the big numbers we are not always primed to kind of understand numbers, to understand the scale of numbers. And so, $20 million in the grand scheme of a state budget is not really a lot of money necessarily, but sort of on its own, it's very easy to use that to kind of to scare people or put people off. But I think, Cheryl, what you're pointing to is why it's so important to have that simple message about the outcome, right?
So
when we talk
do
about
you want childcare? Do we want
Yeah.
free college? So which
Yeah.
of these things don't we want to give people? I mean, there are different ways to look at it that helps people understand that there's some real consequences to the money being spent. One thing I've also found effective is comparison to money spent elsewhere too, that can make a difference. So like the tax cuts were this, or that was this, or, just finding ways to bring it into reality for people. It's so vague out there. And, most people, I have a house, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm struggling, but I'm fine. They don't get the difficulty that everybody's going through. And the importance of a home.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing that is very easy for us to sort of lose track of is that, most people we're speaking to, even folks who are supportive of our work, don't necessarily understand everything that goes into it, or don't realize, the fact that new development happens. And suddenly we have this revitalized neighborhood, and people are out
Right.
on the street walking on brand new sidewalks and going to businesses, and people have new places to live. Folks don't necessarily understand that took public policy, that took tax dollars, that took 1,700 successful community meetings to get approval for a rezone.
Yeah.
People don't necessarily understand those mechanisms, and what some folks in this space of sort of housing messaging and housing message research have really dug into is the fact that we aren't always great at explaining the mechanisms. So when you open that beautiful new development, that's your opportunity, or one of your opportunities to make clear, and in as many and as creative ways as possible, to make clear this is because you came out to support it. Our tax dollars help finance it. These are the grants. This is everything that it takes to do it.
Excellent point, because I think people just don't recognize necessarily, unless they're in the thick of it as you've been, and many of you who are out there listening this are on a daily basis, is this doesn't just happen overnight. This is a very lengthy process. So two other points that I would make that I think you made in your presentation, but I want to emphasize with the group. One is to understand your audience, that not every message works for every audience. So to think about segmenting the audience a little bit, and then also be responsive to shifting your messaging along this lengthy process that you're talking about. So I don't know, Amy, if you want to speak a little bit to those two things in terms of the audience and message shifting.
Absolutely. So, at the start of whether it's a campaign, or you're hoping to cite a new development, or advocating for a new policy, you want to be really, really clear from the beginning who's going to be able, who has the power to kind of get this done, right? Whether that means leaders in a community whose support you need in order to get approval, whether that means these are the legislators or the city council members whose vote you have to get. Understanding sort of what those kind of power levers are, and then figuring out who do you have to talk to, who has to hear your message, in order for those folks to do the thing you need them to do. And Cheryl, you're totally right. It's going to be different messages or sort of different shades of the message, depending on the audience. So I've done some work with local governments that have been going through housing plan process, and there's because it's government, there's sort of a different obligation in terms of the information that you put forward, but the faith groups who support affordable housing have a very different perspective. Just for example, right? They had a very different perspective than the homeowner group that was concerned about development happening in their community. And so, the homeowners were not going to be motivated by the same things that this faith group was. And so just being really clear on, whose help you need, or where the power lies to get done what you need to get done, and then who needs to hear from you and what they need to hear in order to move that forward.
And your concept of shades of difference, it's not that you're doing a different message. You might just be kind of picking out the key messages that might hit home for them within the bigger message. Because that's the other thing that I think we could take this one last thought and then we'll close off. But the other thing is that you don't have to tell everybody everything all the time. And that's something that I find really interesting. Watch some interviews on one of your favorite news shows and think about how, when I've done media training with people in the past, I've always said have 3 key points and don't go beyond those points, if at all possible, during this length of interview. Can you explain a little bit why that's so important in terms of getting people to receive your message?
That's right. So as you sat here in your home or possibly your office with a mask on, sipping your second cup of coffee of the day, watching this presentation this morning, me too. You may have noticed that your attention drifted, right? We are so bombarded with internal and external messages, influences, things that are happening in our lives, things we have to attend to, that we aren't necessarily going to hear every single word or absorb every single message. And so you as a messenger, whether you're speaking, writing, whatever, you want to get to a point where it sort of feels it's starting to feel dull for you because you've said the same thing over and over and over again. When you're at that point, then you're probably at the point where your message is starting to penetrate. That consistency is going to be what makes your message get through. On the other side of it, one thing I was sort of thinking as Cheryl, as you were talking about, not always saying the same thing to the same people. I know sometimes folks get a little bit queasy about that idea of, but I have to share every detail. I can't hide things from people. Right. It feels that some people think marketing is gross. And Cheryl and I don't think marketing is gross, but some people feel that, it feels weird, right? Sometimes if that's not part of your day-to-day, but it's something that we do all the time. You don't tell everything about your entire life to every family member. You don't share every single thing about everything that happened in a meeting with everyone else who you work with. We're selective in the messages and information that we put forward to people because we know there are different things that different people need, or there's a purpose to how we're communicating. And this is just kind of an extension of that.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. Nobody can hear it all. And, you know, I think they say on average, one of the reasons I move around a lot when I'm talking on Zoom is on average, you get about 8 seconds of attention span before a brain starts moving, you know, off to another direction. And if the speaker moves, it draws them back in. I mean, there's little things like that scientifically that we as communications professionals think about, because our main opportunity and our main reason for existence is to help take a cause and move it forward in a positive direction. And to do that, there's a lot of tricks of the trade. It's not like, you know, like Amy said, it is, you know, we sometimes get called PR flags because it's, you know, oh gosh, you're just doing PR. No, we're not. We're providing messaging. We're providing the proper information so people can make educated decisions. And, you know, it's kind of like repeat it enough times and it sticks. So anyway, I thought today's session, it was very, very good. Thank you, Amy, for all of this great information. All of you see that in the end of this presentation, you have Amy's email if you have any further questions of her. Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and end the session. But thank you, Amy. This has been a terrific education on how to communicate your housing message.
Thank you. I so appreciate being able to do this with you all today.
Well, we